Good morning. Firstly, I'd like to thank the European Food Information Council for organising this symposium and for inviting me to participate as the speaker. So, my talk will discuss sugars and sweetness and their impact on the hedonic response to food and how this affects our control of food intake. And furthermore, whether this can improve our understanding of individual differences in the susceptibility to overeat and its role in obesity. So we consume food for nutrition and energy, but of course food is also a potent source of pleasure. And in fact, food is often the cheapest and most available source of pleasure in our daily lives. So it's the effect that food have on our senses, and particularly our sense of taste, that determines its hedonic impact and can shape our food preferences. So each of the 5 basic tastes is thought to function as a biological signpost that rapidly signals to the brain whether a food is likely to be beneficial or harmful to the consumer. So the tastes that convey some physiological benefit to the consumer tend to be those that are perceived as pleasurable. And these can be termed hedonic tastes. So in this way, salty tastes are associated with the presence of sodium, important for fluid balance. Umami tastes are associated with savoury foods, the presence of amino acids, important for protein balance. And for sweet taste, the most common association is with foods rich in simple carbohydrates, and most importantly, sugars that are readily metabolized for use as energy. So it's probably through this unique association in nature between sweetness and the presence of energy density that humans are so strongly attracted to sweetness in their food and drink. So it's plausible to suggest, therefore, even among the hedonic taste, that sweet could have a unique position via its impact on hedonic response and reward to motivate behaviour. And this has implications for its role in human appetite. So in terms of its physiological mechanism, sweetness, we know, acts via taste receptors which are innate, and these comprise 2 G-coupled receptor proteins that are present not only in the mouth and the tongue, but they've also been discovered throughout the gastrointestinal tract. And these are broadly tuned to respond to a range of molecules conveying sweet taste. So studies have shown that in newborn infants, they show an innate preference to sweet tastes. And these preference responses or facial reactions can be observed in a number of species. But infants only tend to prefer solutions that are above the sweetness threshold of lactose, which is the sugar found in breast milk. In modern times, our use of sugars and other compounds conferring sweet tastes has really become ubiquitous. So sweetness can make unpleasant foods palatable, and it's a good way to encourage consumption where there's a need to increase intake, for example, in malnourished individuals. And sweetness and sugars can also enhance the palatability of already nutritious and palatable foods, so they can maximise a product's appeal in a competitive market. So, in fact, the modern usage of sophisticated sweet-tasting compounds, such as non-nutritive sweeteners, also complicates the evolutionary association between sweet taste signalling, carbohydrates, and energy density. And we've switched now from using sweet as a signal for energy to just using sweet for its own sake. And this effectively separates the action of sweetness per se from the effects of sweetness plus energy. And this uncoupling of sweetness from calories has become a key issue, and it's also a frequent confound for understanding the effects of sugar and sweetness on appetite and eating behaviour. So food intake can be understood as a regulatory system, or something we call a homeostatic system. And in this model, energy need arising from the metabolism of metabolically active tissue is thought to create a drive to acquire energy from food. Then this motivation to eat is inhibited by satiety signals secreted from the gastrointestinal tract and released in proportion to fat mass, such as hormones like leptin and insulin. So it's thought that it's the net balance of these stimulatory and inhibitory signals that ultimately determine the food intake and the behaviours that mediate food intake, such as meal size and meal frequency. However, the modern environment, which is full of highly palatable foods, also raises the importance of hedonic influences on food intake. So most often, these inputs are related to hedonic thoughts about food or sensory properties such as added sugars or sweeteners or fat in food, which can have the effect of interacting with homeostatic signals to also influence appetite control. So hedonic and homeostatic systems are both thought to determine behavioural control over appetite and food intake. So this all suggests that with the effect of sugars and sweetness, they could influence food intake through either homeostatic processes or together with hedonic activation of appetite from sweet food. So this overlap between hedonic and homeostatic domains is also conceptualized in John Blundell's satiety cascade. So this depicts the control of food intake to mean either within meal satiation or between meal satiety as mediated by 4 sets of processes. So we have sensory, cognitive, pre-absorptive, and post-absorptive mechanisms. With sweet food, the sensory and cognitive effects, which are generated through the taste and prior associations with the food, stimulate eating through hedonic and cephalic phase responses. So this is in the sort of more immediate term. After continued consumption of the food, then the sweet taste can start to have an inhibitory effect on food intake, particularly for foods which share the same sensory qualities as the food consumed through processes such as sensory-specific satiation. And more recently, research is also uncovering the pre-absorptive or post-ingestive effects of sweetness due to the presence of taste receptors in the stomach and the upper small intestine, where they're linked to the secretion of satiety peptides like GLP-1, gastric inhibitory peptide, where they have an effect on metabolism and satiety. But by far the primary action of sugars and sweetness is through their effects on their hedonic impact and their effects on the reward system. So Capaldi suggested that for food pleasure to be complete, it requires both the sensation and the caloric content of food to be present. And it's also apparent in the semantics of our language, the way we discuss eating and pleasure, that there are subtypes of pleasure. It's not just a matter of our liking for a food. We also talk about processes such as craving or attraction towards certain types of food. And with this, advances in neuroscience are also beginning to reveal distinct networks underpinning reward. And this indicates that reward is not a unitary process at all, but it instead consists of multiple modules or subcomponents of reward. And very broadly speaking, these can be identified according to liking or hedonic pleasure, the affective response to food, and wanting, or our hedonic motivation, or, if you like, the attraction response to food. So we know that food liking is caused by the release of endogenous opioid neurotransmitters, and these act on little clusters of neurons present in the nucleus accumbens, which are called hedonic hotspots. These hedonic hotspots then activate neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex, and this is associated with the subjective experience of pleasure. So we know that more opioids are released with the consumption of sweet compared to non-sweet or bland-tasting food, and also the amount of the opioids released in the brain is associated with the subjective pleasure experienced. On the other hand, the blockade of the opioid system by antagonists such as naltrexone reduces selectively our preference and intake of sucrose, but has no effect on energy equivalent access to non-sweet or bland foods. In terms of food wanting, we know that this is associated with a different basic neurotransmitter, dopamine, and the release of dopamine in the mesocortical limbic pathway is known to foster motivation to engage in rewarding behaviours. So we know, like the opioid system, consuming food also increases levels of brain dopamine, and the amount of dopamine found in the brain also correlates with the amount of pleasure associated with eating. But importantly, dopamine function has been linked to behaviours that are consistent with the wanting response to food and not related to those behaviours that we would consider as liking the food. So wanting is the motivational component of hedonic impact. It's like an impulsive attraction towards food, whereas liking represents the pleasure-giving aspect of food. So while liking may lead to wanting, it doesn't require it to be observed. So with this approach, we understand the hedonic value of food to be determined by both how much we like it and how much we want it. Although we can like a food without necessarily wanting it, known as sham reward, and it's also possible to want a food to a much greater extent to which we actually like it, which has been termed irrational wanting. And with sweet and sugar tastes, we know that they influence both liking and wanting responses. So people like the taste of sweet food, and they also want the calories of sweet food. They are attracted to sweet food. So with the separation of sweet taste sensation from the caloric value, with artificial sweeteners and processing, then it may only deliver partial reward. So the combined effects of sweetness with calories also draws attention to the issue of sweet-fat combinations and formulations in food products. So the combination of sugars and fats in nature is actually relatively rare, but they've become highly common in the modern environment, where they're often processed into so-called hyperpalatable food products. From a consumer's perspective also, an important distinction can be drawn between sweet and non-sweet or savoury taste domains and the fat content of food. So when examined separately under control conditions in the laboratory, we know that the short-term effects of fat on food intake control are much greater than those of sugars. And this is due to their much higher energy density and therefore their effect on passive overeating, or people's failure to compensate for the increased energy density. We know also in epidemiological studies that have examined the relative contribution of sugar and fat with body mass index. So, for example, in the UK, Jenny McDermid has analysed a large database called the Dietary Nutrition Survey of British Adults. And this group found that there was an association between the amount of dietary fat consumed and level of body mass index, but there was no relationship between sugar intake and BMI. And if anything, the trend was actually negative between those two. When they split down the sugar intake into different types of food, so comparing fruits to dairies, sugar products, sugar-sweetened beverages, and sweet-fat combinations, the only positive association they found was the relationship between the sweet-fat combination foods and BMI, and that was only in women. So this suggests that there are some interesting individual differences in people's, in the importance of sweet-fat foods on appetite and weight control. And these types of observations of the variability in people's response to the sensory properties of food have led our group to question whether sweet-fat foods could be more rewarding in certain groups of people, and whether this could contribute to our understanding of susceptibility to overeating. So in our laboratory, we use validated methodology to quantify sensations of appetite using visual analog scale methodology. But we've also more recently developed a computerized tool to measure the hedonic impact of different types of food, and in particular the liking and wanting components of food reward. So generally, people are very good at estimating how much they like a food because it tends to be quite stable from moment to moment. But on the other hand, people are often very bad at knowing their true wanting for a food, because wanting is a process that happens more in the moment. It's something that is quite volatile. It can switch directions. It can be transferred from one food onto another. And because of this difference in how the processes operate, and to try and avoid contaminating our liking and wanting measures, we measure wanting indirectly according to how quickly participants make choices between foods. And in our task, we use an array of food images in order to compare responses according to shared sensory and nutrient qualities of foods, such as the sweetness and fat content. So in the liking measure, subjects are just asked to rate each image according to how pleasant it would be to taste some of that food. But in the wanting measure, they're presented with the same images, but this time in randomized pairs. So the participants instructed to choose the food they most want to eat at that moment. They have to do so as quickly and accurately as possible. And then we use the average speed of response for those different food categories as an indication of wanting. So a greater reaction time relative to other categories in the task is more wanting for that category. And importantly, this gives the potential for our wanting measure to be dissociated from our liking scores. So just to give you an example, they're shown the instruction on screen replaced by a crosshair, and this is replaced by two random images. They have to choose which one they would most want, and then they cycle through all the pairs and combinations of images in the task. So the scoring procedure for this task means that we can calculate separate scores for liking and wanting responses, and we can do this according to the four sweet-fat combination categories, or we can do it according to people's relative bias for, say, high over low-fat foods, or for sweet over non-sweet foods. So using these techniques, we've conducted a number of studies in our lab now where we're interested in whether the sensory properties of food are indeed more rewarding in certain groups of people who may be susceptible to overeating. So in this particular study, we investigated whether varying the sweet taste of an equicaloric, equipalatable preload had an impact on reward and food intake in women that varied in their susceptibility to overeating. So here we gave participants either a sweet, savoury or bland tasting drink of about 250 calories. The participants would arrive to our lab in a hungry state after consuming a standard breakfast, and then they'd consume one of the preloads, and then after 30 minutes, they'd be given access to an ad libitum test meal, which consisted of a very large quantity of tomato and herb risotto. And we measured their liking and wanting for different types of food after consumption of the preload in their condition. Then finally, on a separate day, we used the three-factor eating questionnaire disinhibition subscale in order to classify and compare susceptible and non-susceptible individuals within our sample. So firstly, these are the results for the ad libitum food intake at the test meal. So what we found is that the susceptible group on the right-hand side of the graph were actually consuming more food than the non-susceptible, but this was specifically after being exposed to the sweet preload. There was no difference after savoury or bland-tasting preloads. Next, when we examined their liking and wanting scores between our groups, we found firstly that irrespective of preload condition, the susceptible group, and this is on the left-hand side, was showing greater liking across all food types, indicated by the red bars. But we found a different pattern evident in their scores on wanting. So here there was a greater wanting only for the sweet-fat combination of foods. And finally, we compared reward bias scores for sweet food in terms of liking and wanting responses in each preload condition. So here, scores greater than 0 indicate increased bias towards sweet food over non-sweet. And firstly, in terms of the liking responses, we saw no differences between susceptible and non-susceptible groups, but we did see that there was a greater sweet bias after consuming the savoury preload. So this is consistent with the sensory-specific sort of transfer effects going on. In terms of their wanting scores, however, we found that there was a difference between susceptible and non-susceptible groups. So here the susceptible group was showing a greater sweet bias after consuming the sweet preload, whereas the non-susceptible group, their sweet bias actually decreased slightly after consuming the sweet preload. So this is also consistent with the intake behaviour that we saw in the test meal. So finally, I'd like to close this talk with a few thoughts on the issue of food addiction. So this is relevant because it's a concept that really appears to be on course to merge with a lot of the research being done on the hedonic impact of food, and particularly of sugars, on food intake and obesity. So it's the importance of hedonics in appetite and current prevalence in obesity that's led to the term food addiction and sugar addiction being used to convey messages to the public about the potency of certain foods, in particular processed sugars and fats, and also to draw conclusions about the nature of certain individuals who are attracted towards those foods. So the labelling of individuals as food addicts, for example. And there's really been an explosion of scientific research and debate on this issue of food addiction. And this is partly due to the development of animal models recently of sugar and junk food addiction, and more recently to the development of a scale for measuring food addiction in humans, where the authors have used the DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence and adapted them and applied them to food and eating behaviour. So the thing that strikes you when you read the scientific literature is that a lot of authors are already starting with the assumption that food intake is a valid concept, and therefore that some foods will induce features of drug addiction if consumed in the long term. And this clearly has implications for consumers, the way we view foods, but it also has quite serious implications for the food industry, who, in the extreme case, might start to see some of their products labelled as addictive substances. So while scientific debate on food addiction is very necessary and welcome, unfortunately, the experimental evidence on the concept is lacking, and the conclusions being drawn about food addiction are really lagging behind the evidence available. So in fact, we've written recently to argue that the label of food addiction is presently rather unhelpful for research, and that it's in danger of confusing the issue of hedonic impact of food and its role in overeating and obesity. And there are a number of reasons that we need to, we think, take stock before consensus is reached on the validity of food addiction. So firstly, there's really no convincing evidence on what the addictive substance might actually be in food in order that it can be isolated for study. Secondly, the notion of food addiction doesn't account for what we already know about the complex homeostatic mechanisms involved in food intake and obesity. And this information really doesn't fit the hypothesis. Thirdly, there's no link yet, and this is quite important. There hasn't been a link established between the concept of food addiction and the role of these hyperpalatable, high-fat, high-sugar food combinations, which are so central to the hypothesized progression of the food addiction cycle. So, as an interim conclusion, we think that classification of large numbers of individuals as food addicts or sugar addicts is presently premature. And it could even lead to negative consequences, such as unnecessary stigmatization of some individuals. So I'll just summarize the talk. So the hedonic impact of sweet food on food intake, we need to consider the combination of its sensory and its caloric constituents. Also, the hedonic impact of food is more than just its perception of liking. It involves other psychological subcomponents. And for some individuals, we know that exposure to sweet food has the capacity to exert effects after consumption via motivation, hedonic food wanting. We know these susceptible individuals show greater food liking overall and enhanced food wanting and intake specifically for these high sweet, high fat combination foods. However, classifying some of these individuals as food addicts we think is probably inappropriate. And we think the issue for research should focus more on individual differences in the intensity of people's hedonic response to food, especially food wanting, for specific and well-characterized food types. So I'd just like to acknowledge my research team at University of Leeds, sources of funding from the EU FP7 projects, Food for Health and Satin, and thanks very much for your attention.